Hello, everyone. Welcome to a festival of films celebrating the work of Saba Dewan and Rahul Roy. This is a festival put together by a collection of film collectives spread across India called In Solidarity. Uh, we thought this is a fantastic occasion to really discuss the works of Rahul Roy, especially spread over 4 films. He has a much larger repertoire, but we are looking at 4 films that are going to be screened at this festival, which are When Four Friends Meet, Majma, The City Beautiful, and The Factory. We have with us Gautam Bhan, urban studies writer and researcher. Welcome, Gautam. And we also have Sanjay Srivastava, a sociologist who has primarily looked at urban studies and masculinities in his work. His most recent book is Entangled Urbanism, Slum Gated Communities and Shopping Mall in Delhi and Gurgaon. In a sense, both Gautam and Sanjay's works talk directly to Rahul's films, and Rahul's films talk directly to their work. So this is a fantastic opportunity to bring these three in conversation. I am Surabhi Sharma, documentary filmmaker from Mumbai, been a keen follower of Rahul's work. His work has really influenced and informed me, and I have also been looking at informal labor in cities, primarily Mumbai, and in the recent past, a certain lens of masculinity has also come into my work through Bhojpuri music and the production and performance of the music in Bombay. So these are 4 people who are very invested in the city together. I would like to open with just sort of drawing out the broad ideas around Rahul's work. One of the first thing that strikes me, which is very different from my own work, is Rahul's work is really like an ode to Delhi. Uh, all 4 films are located within Delhi. Uh, Apart from the themes within the film, there is a very keen and clear both affection and commitment to the city. And that comes through or shines through actually in all 4 films very, very vividly. Apart from that, Rahul's films have really been looking at um, informal economy, the communities that are invested in informal economies, and looking at the men in these communities. And through that lens is really a way to paint a picture of Delhi, which is not something that we have seen often. Delhi has been epitomized as the political capital of our country, and more often than not, debates get centered around that. I think Rahul opens up another way of engaging with the city, but specifically Delhi. On that note, I'd like to invite Gautam to come in with your own way of engaging with the themes in Rahul's film, but also the spaces it opens up.
Thanks, Surabhi. And it's a real pleasure to be here. I think I have been watching Rahul's films for a very long time now, and actually have been had the pleasure to sort of encounter them first just as a viewer, and then to think of them as someone who used the films in so many different ways around training, around with my own students, in public discussion forums. And so I've always loved both what they've given to me, but also what they can open up. So it's a real pleasure to be able to talk to you about this. And I'm also happy because I get to, in a sense, ask Rahul a set of questions to give him a chance to reflect a little bit on how one reads these 4 films together. Right? And we're talking about Majma, City Beautiful, Factory, and When Four Friends Meet. And so, Rahul, the first thing I wanted to ask you is, one of the things that really strikes me in watching these films as a set is a sense of, thinking of the mode of making a film as an act of chronicling, as an act of bearing witness of certain kind. And I think that I'm struck so much how often, one, that there is this intimacy of your presence in all of these films. You feel like you're inside a home in a conversation over dinner, and there's an idea of sort of a receding camera almost, but you're always present, but in this deeply intimate way. And I think that there's many ways in which we talk about cities. We often tell very grand histories, I think Delhi, particularly, is one of those places that has these long, sweeping, grand histories. I wanted you to talk to us a little bit about the way you think about your work as a filmmaker, particularly on this idea of being a chronicler of the city, is it about the notion of telling histories, of bearing witness, of chronicling change, of simply holding on to a moment amidst all the multitudes of changes that are going on? How do you think and position your own work as a way of chronicling?
Thanks, Gautam. I think, see, part of it was an accident in the sense that it wasn't really planned. The way my sort of Delhi foray into chronicling Delhi unfolded over many years. Um,
Mm.
first film on which I could say is really on Delhi was When Four Friends Meet, uh,
Yeah.
which was which it's only when after I made that film did I start really very seriously thinking of that film being the sort of the first step towards looking at at larger time and the city, and looking at how actually one can start mapping the city and time, and not in terms of just sort of um, you know as time which is which can be read in terms of 2000 or 2004 and 2008 and 2010, but really how do people and landscapes and their memories and their experiences change over time, and does that itself become a story of a city as to what is really happening to people over several decades, because Four Friends, as you all know, was followed by a sequel about 12, 13 years later, Till We Meet Again, because Four Friends ends at the point where we say we will meet again after 10 years and see where everyone is. Um,
Yeah.
so, so you see, to tell you honestly, when I finished Four Friends, um, and this was also the time when I had sort of, it was my early years of engagement with the theme of masculinity and young men. What I realized post the film was that here is a film which is looking at spaces which can broadly be called really the liminal spaces, which is neither home nor really the outside, but these are
Mm.
these sort of intimate spaces created by my characters and with me. Um, and as I was struggling to make sense of and trying to come to grips with my own understanding of masculinities in men's lives and informal labor lives, uh, what I felt was that I've done a film which is looking really, which is in sort of nowhere space. uh,
Yeah.
what about the public space? How do we start looking at lives, at masculinities, at you know uh, informality of labor in a very public way? What?
Yeah.
How would you sort of do something like that? And that's how Majma was actually.
Mm.
I made Majma, which was entirely in a public space, which is a market. There is the entire shooting is just for a couple of sequences I go inside homes,
Yeah.
but otherwise the entire film is in a public space, in a market. And so it was going from one space to another, looking at people's lives. And once I had finished Majma, I felt that I'd done a film which was in this nowhere space. I've done a film on an entirely public space. What about the domestic? What about entirely a film which is completely inside? And that's how City Beautiful was born. which is a film actually entirely in the domestic space, and from within that space, it's reflecting on the world and on what is happening to people outside, and what do they come into the domestic space with, and what do they bring into the domestic space, men and women, and and the film City Beautiful, of course, moves a step ahead of these other two films, which have basically male characters. And City Beautiful actually then and because it is the domestic space, and it's a domestic sphere, women had to play a very central role, and so women come into the film, and that the relationship between men and women in a very sort of intimate way, I explore. So what I'm trying to say is that part accident, part the way I thought of the films, I think those all sort of somewhere now with hindsight, I can say that, look, if I look at a film made in 98, 99, and I look at a film made in 2013 and look at the same space and the same people who had filmed in 98, 99, you get a sense of the city and what's happened to the city, both visually in terms of, the landscape, and what's happened inside people's heads and minds. So it's, so the chronicling part was, it's happened because of the way I thought of the films, and but it was not to sort of to answer your question directly. It was not part of strategy.
But even if it was a more serendipitous archive, I mean, the fact that you thought consciously about moving between these type of spaces is what gives layers to those different kind of stories and allows them to add up. And it strikes me so much. You just call City Beautiful in your mind a turn to the domestic. And in a way, it absolutely is. But, I was seeing it again yesterday after a gap of many years. And what really struck me was both between this and the factory was, one of the big questions we struggle with in urban studies and research, not just in film, is how do you tell the story of these big structural changes? Okay? There's from industrial capitalism to new forms of economy. We have all these shorthands, post-91, liberalization, new economy. But how do you hold on and feel a story like this? Like how do you manage to think about what that big structure is doing? And what was really striking to me this time in City Beautiful was just how much I kept returning to this move from handloom to powerloom, and how much it became a kind of moment that held this, a moment that you put your finger on that say, this domestic is structured by these larger shifts in the things we have understood as work and value and economy, and I think that one of the things that has really always, and even in terms of masculinity, it's this ability to, and I wanted your reflection on this, is an ability to say, can we humanize big structural shifts in a way without losing the larger structures of power, without making it one household story, but not also needing it to be representative of every household story. And in some way, I wanted to get your thoughts on thinking about how one moved between the story of a neighborhood defined by a mode of production that can no longer hold it, but also make it a story of intimacy and masculinity and employment and pride and social norms. So is there a way in which, how does one think about bridging this individual story with these big structural changes? And that goes back to moving between the city and the person, the anecdote and the case and the pattern, right? In some way. And research, we grapple with this in a very different way. But in film, you've done it in a very different way.
No, in fact, see, that was the big challenge for City Beautiful. When I started researching for City Beautiful, that was what hit me straight on very early. That here is an entire community which is, which is going through a massive shift and change because of the grand sort of the liberalization and the big, huge economic changes that are happening in the country, and it's affecting this entire community. And now, to me, um, what was the challenge was not to get locked with trying to explain the big change, but to be able to actually how do people make sense, or how do the people live through that change? What do people feel through that change? How do relationships change through that change? How do people start looking at relationships differently through that change? And what it does, see, let's also not forget that the point is that uh, there is also something to be gained here for people, especially for women, very
Absolutely.
clearly. And so that
As Radha says in the film, right? She's trying to make a
Shakuntala
move out. Yeah,
Shakuntala has already made that move. Radha is
absolutely.
on the verge of making that move. And see, the other issue, which was very clearly there, was the change in the nature of labor. Handloom, the way it was, where it involved family labor, that was shifting to wage labor. So there was, the kind of changes inside families in that within that community was like, it was completely, changing entire family structures and power equations within families in a dramatic way. So now, as a filmmaker, in that sense, I'm much more lucky than Professor Sanjay Srivastava, in the sense that our work is corporeal. It has to do with bodies and with how one can see and look at at, at real people and human beings, and see challenges, of course, to go beyond that into what is happening inside people's heads, and be able to get those thoughts and feelings and stories out. But yeah, it was, to me, it was very clear, in that film right through, that while I was dealing with, as to why all these shifts and changes and dramas happening in this family was happening because of these large shifts and changes that were happening in the Indian economy. But I had to sort of really focus on
Yeah.
these families and the extended community, and keep sort of pegging at it through stories, through through frustrations, through just the look on people's faces, as to what was that change about in
Yeah.
people's real lives.
So one last one from me before I hand over to Sanjay for a bit and pop back in. You know, again, this question of time and space that you brought up several times, and I think it's, that's what's really strayed with me is how much of this unfolding, and this goes back to that sense of chronicling, right? Because this is not something one can unearth in a moment. There's a kind of ethnographic presence that has to be built over the sense of time. And I think here there's such a notion of importance of understanding this change, but also giving us a language in which to talk about the change that is not just the conceptual and the structural and the academic. And I think that's what I got from so many of the films reading again, to talk about masculinity in a way that men speak of their bodies, to talk about labor in a way that, talk about honor and work. As this line has stayed with me all day yesterday when Radha is trying to get out and go to work in City Beautiful, and he talks about बेइज्जती, and she says बेइज्जती तो घर में ही शुरू हो जाती है, बाहर जाने की क्या जरूरत है? And I think that it's about that the language in which the arguments are made is itself an archive of its own, paralleling all these other ways we diagnose structural histories. But I felt in some ways that with Factory, actually something changed in some ways. It felt very different to me from the other three. It had to be, of course, it is a completely different, it felt like an encounter in some ways that you had. I felt in the film I could see so much more of you, a sense of anger, a sense of bearing witness. And it was in some ways the most explicitly structural films. I mean, there were slides with data and numbers and talking about economic changes. It was, and it certainly retreated into the intimacy. I remember at some point, there's a shot of the train when you go to the home of one of the arrested workers and you speak to his wife. And then it's back to sort of a Rahul Roy film I recognize, right? And it gets quiet. And then she's talking about, and she says, she's praying and you say, do you believe? And she says, I used to. And it's just this little moment of quiet where you realize what it means, right, to be in a context of being on the outside of this. But the film also has a much stronger sense of saying, this is the way we must look at this. This is the truth of this, right? And it's an encounter with, and just like just like City Beautiful talked about cotton, polyester, talked about the economy as its structural ghost, here it's the law. And it's the courts and the police stations, and you're recreating these artifacts, you're reading from judgment documents, there's the typewriter typing the case number, and there's all this, there's the form of saying, I'm actually talking about something much bigger. And it felt like a different voice, sort of urgent and necessary, and even in moments angry in a way. And I just wanted to hear from you a little bit in that way about sort of, taking this presence and listening to these stories, but also saying, there is something I have to put on the ground here. There is something I have to say here. Did it feel similarly to you while you were making it in that way? Did you feel different from the other set of films that we're talking about today?
See, all films have stories. The point is that each film has a beginning and a unique beginning. And with each film, you are, as a filmmaker, you are, entering into dialogue with your own history of films and filmmaking, as well as, the grammar and history of filmmaking practiced by others around you. All that's constantly influencing each film. And with The Factory, it was, for a long time, I'd given up on making sort of explicit political films which dealt with an immediate political issue. I'd kind of given up on it. That's how I started my filmmaking career, but I just dropped it for issues and reasons which, when I dropped it, I didn't have the wherewithal or the competency to somehow be able to penetrate, the world of politics and yet be able to humanize people. Because to me, the real project of my documentary practice is how am I able to really humanize people. That's my central sort of object, and that's what I constantly work and rework with that idea. And and when I stopped making explicit political films, which dealt with important political issue of that moment, it was out of a lot of frustration as to how do you actually make a film which is on a political event or a political moment, and which is politically alive, and yet be able to look at people and to be able to create narratives and characters who are human, who are not superheroes or who are supervillains, but are actually humans with very different shades. That I was a challenge, and Factory in that sense was an attempt to go back to where I started and be able to do something which was which was politically a live issue and an iconic struggle. Really, the Maruti workers' struggle is an iconic struggle and an heroic struggle with all the actors being really heroic and 147 of them being in jail. And how do I then make a film which is able to which is political, but yes, is also is able to actually deal with all those people in ways that it goes beyond just a political issue film. You know, it still has human beings crisscrossing, traveling through the film. And as know that from my other sort of abiding interest has been the everyday, as to how do you tell stories about the everyday, and what does the everyday hide, and how can you actually get stories from the everyday which become which can become uh, you know stories which tell us much more. And so what I set myself up as a challenge was, can I do a film which is on the everyday of a struggle which has actually been defeated, which is over. There is no struggle. The struggle is over. It's defeated. There is a court case going on with 2,500 workers out, 147 workers in jail being tried for murder. And is there an everyday to that, moment in the struggle? And how do I get to that everyday of that struggle? And what can I speak of through that? So that was really what I was trying to do. And also, you pointed out about that train sequence and this other woman. In fact, there is that other sequence with one of the leaders when in his house, I have a conversation with him and his wife. And, which is important in the sense that, to me, as to what becoming heroic is, there are various stories behind that, and there are ways in which people are entangled into that heroism, which we never hear of. We don't hear of in a working class struggle film, you never see the domestic. It's always about actually the what's happening outside and what's urgent and what's on the street or in sort of meetings. So in that sense, I tried to sort of put in the domestic. I tried to get in an aspect which you don't see in a political struggle film, and to see what is happening within the domestic even in this moment of a struggle. So what I'm saying is that each film poses its own challenges, and you try and answer those through your filmmaking practice and through what you see of other people's work and engage with. So that's the story behind The Factory.
And we are lucky to have that constant attempt to find an archive of an urban everyday, through which to read these larger changes. And I could ask you endlessly about also what your films say about urbanization and the nature not only of Delhi but about cities. But I'm sure Sanjay will pick up some of those themes. So let me hand over to him for a bit. I'm eager to also think of the things in his responses and his questions too. Sanjay?
Okay, thank you, and thanks for organizing this. So, yeah, we've had various conversations over the years, including in other parts of South Asia. So, which I think the issue been dealt, people not just from India but from other parts of that part of the world. So let me begin with just one question. It's more not really a question, but I think it's like more something to like a discussion point. So, of course. The films are, masculinity is a theme that runs through the films. And one is, of course, to think of these men in very specific contexts in the work and the city and public space and the domestic space. So that the films obviously tell us something about men in specific contexts, which will, of course, on the one hand, give us the impression that this is something called masculinity it's a very solid thing that they are a part of. But of course, your films also, for the viewer, is also about the kind of unmaking of masculinities for all these men, right? So they may have, in other sort of happier times, these men would have been much more certain of their masculinities. When they had jobs or when they lived in villages, you come to the city and you're at the bottom of the hierarchy. So the heroic figure is, of course, a very, very also a figure that is completely being undone in the city. That's one sense that I have, if I watch your films. And then and so that's one part I wanted to talk to you about. And the second part is, of course, that um, you yourself, as a filmmaker, as a particular kind of person, may not, while you're filming novels, you may not necessarily subscribe to their notion of masculinity. You're recording their notion of masculinity. Now, given these two contexts, one is the constant unraveling of their sort of working class masculinity, much more than, say, mine or yours, because we're not necessarily put in that position. And the second, that you may not subscribe to it. I wonder how you avoid, and there's this tendency, I guess, in many, there could be a tendency in many such recordings of the men, and obviously you try very hard that that doesn't happen, to come across as caricatures, right? Because it's because the audience who watches these films is a very specific kind of audience. A lot of them may not obviously subscribe, whether it's when Five Friends Meet, or whether it's City Beautiful, or even Majma, for example. So there is, for an audience, there may be kind of a not inherent, but some kind of thing to think of them as caricatures, people who are completely removed from us. And, they're strange, and I wonder how you, and it doesn't happen. I'm saying it doesn't happen, and I wonder if you, when you were making these films, you had any of this when you were thinking about it. Because for me, the most significant thing would be that I'm so removed from their worlds, and that they may come across to me as caricatures. But the film, I think, manages not to do that, but to record these masculinities as men position certain structures, and this is what happens to them. And I wonder if when you were making these films, whether this was something that you were thinking about, to consciously avoid them coming across as some kind of caricatured people, men.
See, see, when I meet When Four Friends Meet, it was the second film on masculinity, very essentially with the thought that I'm making a film on masculinity. It's my second film on that theme. The starting point actually was very interesting in the sense that this came out of a project where 4 films were made in Nepal, Pakistan, India, and Bangladesh. Now, the filmmakers, when and the first meeting of all the 4 filmmakers was a process where actually we didn't talk about the films, because when I was designing the project, what I felt was that all the 4 filmmakers should be approaching the project from their own position of being male and being men. And how is that consciousness and self-awareness going to actually make the project, and how will that how will it inform the project, was the starting point. So actually the first meeting of the 4 filmmakers in Kathmandu was a workshop where all 4 of us were locked in a room, and we went through our own experiences of growing up, of relationships, of all kinds of stuff that we could identify as that those were critical to our own becoming what men, or unmaking of our masculinity, whichever way you want to look at it. So that was actually the first thing that we did in this project. So in that sense, it entirely informed the film that I made, because actually, a lot of the stuff which I know people find funny and the sort of misinformation and lack of information, or the mythologies, I actually grew up with them. I grew up in small towns, and I grew up with a lot of those issues in my head. So it was not as if there was a separation of class between me and Sanju, Bunty, Kamal, and Sanjay. But the fact is that for at least till my early teens, I had the same thoughts in my head. I grew up with those thoughts, it is only that, my class and my education and my cultural background gave me an opportunity at one stage to, cross that and be able to acquire, experiences and knowledge and be kicked by women, especially, to become slightly more sane. Otherwise, I had those exactly the same, I grew up with those same ideas. So in that sense, it it was not something which I ever felt it was coming into from these strange things being said by these characters. It was actually a harking back on my own memories of what I was like and what I thought like. So in that sense, there was, there was a connection, and because that connection was there, I think it also gave me certain indications as to what of how to actually, what can you do in, in these kind of situations where, you know, things are being said which some people may find offensive, some people may find troubling, some people may object to. And these are your characters. These are people that you're working with in your film. What do you do then? And only, and the related question that always comes up is about these very intimate spaces and this very, very, intimate conversations. And so the way, at least I have handled it, is that as long as I actually have a genuine respect for people I'm working with in a film, that respect itself will take care of how that character ultimately will look like, evolve in that film. And that is the golden rule that I follow, that as I shouldn't lose respect for the people I work with. If I don't lose respect of the people I work with, then the film will unfold, with that same feeling. It could be tough on people. I'm not saying that you can't be tough on people, but there is a way in which that respect, if you have that respect, it'll get reflected in your film. I'll give you an example of Hira Lal in City Beautiful. Okay, Hira Lal is a character that, Reena Mohan, the editor of the film, we've never struggled with a character as much as Hira Lal in a film. And Reena's edited a lot of my films. The problem was that Hira Lal was, we could have you see, that's the thing about filmmaking. It's ultimately you can make a character look like anything, even if it's so-called documentary and the real. The way characters, get formed in a film is entirely in your hand. And Hira Lal could have been a really dark black character in the film. Because we had all the material to make him into a really dark black character, but that wasn't Hira Lal. He was that also. He was a dark, character, but he was also a beaten character, completely beaten at that age by the circumstances. And so we actually worked and worked and worked till we felt we got a balance, and we got a sense of what Hira Lal, at least in my experience, was is as a human being. And so I think that is what, a long answer to your question, Sanjay, but that is how you have to work with, building characters in a film.
So when you say when we were happy with that, we got a balanced picture. I mean, what does that mean? What would it mean so that so someone watching it doesn't has a sense that, that's a complex world you're dealing with.
So if you look at Hira Lal in City Beautiful, now, you can see him as someone who was, an alcoholic, who's abusive, who is, is lying around doing nothing, ordering his daughter-in-law.
Hmm.
But then you have, other sequences with him, which show his vulnerability, which show actually his, as to, what he's trying to do, what he's trying to think, that how he's still desperately trying to figure out how can he get work, where and how can he get work, and how can he go there. You also have Hiralal as, which is a kind of a really side sequence in the film about, as a Navratra singer. And, it immediately, Hiralal starts looking much more complex character than just someone who we could have just had him as really this, this nasty character who, who's terrible in the domestic sphere. And unfortunately, that's what you see most of times in films. You have characters who fit certain clear slots because you want to say that. You want to create that sharpness of black and white. And so and to me, I'm not interested in black and white at all. I'm not interested in making sort of these, ideological, victories through making these cliched statements. So if you are a human being, all relationships are troubled. There's no perfect relationship in this world. All relationships are troubled. And, and we all behave in all kinds of strange, weird, terrible ways in various relationships that we are in. We are sometimes good, we are sometimes bad, we are sometimes terrible, sometimes we are absolutely fantastic. And, and if I'm doing a film which is on relationships, which is so centrally on relationships, the characters should be able to reflect that entire spectrum of experience of a relationship.
And I think that if the Hiralal or other characters were in fact uh, sort of cardboard cutouts, then the other thing that you were able to do in your films, I don't think you'd be able to do, and I think something that Gautam has also alluded to, which is to think about structure. What is the structure in which people are based? Otherwise you do get quite often films on, say, men and masculinities or working class, which have where because the central figures are very much figures that we can easily identify as this or that. There's no sense of structure. We have no idea what it is that makes people, and that's I think why you're able to. It seems to me make people think about structure. Which is very difficult. As in writing, I can write, and this is like, this is industry, and this is class, and this is changing from Fordism to whatever it is, and that. But I think it's much more difficult thing to do in a film because you can't show structure. I mean, if you show a factory, it means nothing, right? I think, and so is that something that you I mean, clearly, I mean, in broader discussions, you think about that. But to think about how do you actually show structure when you're in a film, in a visual thing, it's impossible to just show a factory and say, this is the class structure, right? You can't. I know you started off by saying that unlike academics, you look at real people, but but I want to ask you, how is it that because I mean, it would be, is that something you think about? Because I find in lots of films is very centrally about men and masculinity, but there's no sense of what structure people men are in and why is it they end up being that kind of man. You don't have to sympathize with them, but try to understand what's and is that something you think about?
All the time, Sanjay. In fact, that is the starting point mostly. Fact is that we had some good training in terms of research, and starting point for our research is always the structure. In a way, you read all the books and you read everything, all the material available. So actually, you're starting, with the structure, and the fact is also that a lot of my earlier work, and Saba and I, when we used to do work together, make films together, a lot of our films were about the structure. So we did this series called Women in Agriculture.
Yeah, I remember. Yes. Yeah.
Which was actually about the structure, and then we tried to fit in women into that structure, our characters, and to somewhere make our argument. And that's what I rebelled against at one point. I said, I cannot do this anymore. I cannot actually have a dissertation on structure and then put my characters to prove my various points. So I had to do it the other way around. That how do I actually start from characters and come to a structure?
Yes.
Is it possible to do that? Can we inverse it and and reverse it? And can we still come to a structure through actually how and how people talk about it, in the most sort of everyday way, how people talk about something that's happened to them, something that's
it.
How they're making a call to some guy, or it's, and I felt that the point is that it's not that looking at my film is ever going to explain the entire sort of change in the handloom sector and the emergence of power looms and things. No, that's not the purpose, and I'm not interested in that. But I am interested in actually people somewhere locking into the idea that there are these things going on in the background, and there is an emotive sort of attachment that these things and emotive shifts and changes that are happening to people's lives because of these large scale structural changes. And by mapping those and by finding those, it was really like found objects, and by finding those objects, which somewhere are mapping the emotive journey of people through these structural changes. Can I still have a comment on the on the structure, and also a critique, as well as as something which becomes evidence of it, as that it's also witnessing it.
You're right. I think those early films which you referred to are, I mean, these are your words. I don't feel guilty. I mean, kind of dissertation on structure. Yeah. I'm glad I didn't say it. But anyway, okay, finally, as I remember that film, I can't remember where it was, but somewhere in a
Not a
village
bad
somewhere.
film, it's just that
No,
we
I'm
had
not saying it's a bad film. I never said it's a
no.
bad film.
I'll tell you what we used to do. We used to write an essay, and
Yeah.
we used to
Not
research. We
such a
used to read
bad thing.
like no. For you, it's not bad. For a filmmaker, it's terrible. So, you would read all the books possible. You would gather all the literature possible. We would talk to all the experts possible, and then write an essay.
I remember. Yes, I remember that. Yeah.
And then go about finding characters who would,
Yes.
fit into that essay.
Yes. Okay, finally, because I'm probably running out of time. You said that you moved from filming in a sort of in-between space to household and to the public space. But actually, I mean, and in fact, and the factory, which is a sort of both, a mixture of both. But I have to say that whenever I watch all these 4 films, I thought they were all about actually liminal spaces. Because in all these films, although in your mind you say that this is about a family, a domestic space, this is about a public space, about threshold space, in the minds of the characters, there's complete contiguity between, I don't see the characters themselves imagine. So I always thought of them, in fact, and that's why it's easy for me to discuss, if I use them in a classroom situation, about the city being this completely mixed up space, although we might say there is domestic and there is a public. In fact, in all these films, they're always, to me, about threshold spaces. The people always own these threshold spaces, although at least sort of putatively, obviously, filming-wise, they may be in one specific space. So I'm not disagreeing with you, but it seems to me as a viewer, my sense is that it allows me, in fact, these films to see the city as having these sort of household and street, etc. But actually, the kind of places that people occupy are completely on thresholds. They're never really within the household or on the street. And you see that in Majma, for example, which is about the street, but then Barkat, for example, and the others, I mean, they seem to be always not distinguishing as much as you might. as a filmmaker between these two spaces?
Yeah, no, see, when I said spaces, I meant that, there is a physical space that a film has to deal with, and within that physical geographical space, um, your characters have to evolve or occupy or tell their stories or events have to happen around that physical space. So I was talking about that those are the sort of three really spaces that to me became interesting to actually get into the conversations. Yes, you're right, it's actually the intimate conversations which are liminal, which can happen, which could have happened anywhere, you know. But the fact that they're situated in certain physical spaces is what I think is giving them specific meanings in the context of each of those films. And and I think that is what I was trying to, at least for myself,
Yeah.
defining for myself a space which is my limit. By limiting myself to that space, what kind of a story can I tell?
Mm, mm, mm. Yeah, just quickly, I think what the other thing I want to add was that I have a sense when I watched these films that you were filming people of a different class, they would have a very different sense of space. Whereas the people you work with in these four films, their sense of space is very different. And that's also, I mean, interesting for me genuinely because it's something you can explain in a way that you can't quite often in an article or a book to a class, to a class of students about different meanings of space that people of different backgrounds might have. So that's the view. Yeah. Okay, back to Surabhi or Gautam. Whoever would like to.
Yeah, actually, I wanted to come in because just to pick up just a
Save
sec,
me,
from
save me, save me from these two academics.
Yeah, we were
Just
very,
baat.
yeah,
Yeah,
so sweetly, man.
yeah. बदतमीज
it
आदमी
was
हो.
lovely actually to hear them because they managed to sort of put together a lot of my own thoughts about your film in a far more succinct way, I suppose. But to put on the filmmaker hat, just one thing that I've always wanted to actually talk to you about, but somehow again in many discussions it never came up. What I've found fascinating seeing all four films together actually is that both Majma and When Four Friends Meet are both films that are very that are led by you. The structure of the film is determined by you in a manner of speaking. You sort of intervene and propose questions and observations and so on and so forth. Whereas in The City Beautiful, you allow what's happening to people. That observation starts determining the flow and the structure of the film, and that continues in The Factory. I'm not using the word an observational film for either City Beautiful and for The Factory, and thank God for that because I find that form a bit problematic. But here, in these two films, you really step back and maybe dismantle your own thesis almost entirely. You're willing to do that, to let what's happening with people and what they're saying really determine the shape of the film. I know it's a continuous journey and one would have led you to the other, but I was also wondering if it was the theme or the time you were at, the times you were filming in that determined this shift in the way you structured your films.
No, Surabhi, I think that, partly it is about an evolving practice. And, with each film, you look back and see uh, how you could have done better or what you could have done better or, how would you have done it differently. So I think by the time I made The City Beautiful, my practice itself had come to a point where I was, I'd made a decision that I am going to sit in this place in these two houses for 1 year, and I am going to see uh, what I get and what do I encounter through that 1 year in these two houses. And so in that sense, that decision started informing how I was filming and what kind of way in which I would I would get the material for a film. The other thing related is that the fact of the matter is that I am not really a filmmaker who was taught much of filmmaking. We just struggled making films, and we learned whatever we learned out of actually our own practice and of watching other films, and with some sort of discussions with other filmmakers. So actually, till a certain point, I didn't even know what what kind of, how would you slot my films. It's only when my films actually started traveling to film festivals, and especially to Europe, when Europeans told me that I'm an observational filmmaker, I said, okay, thank you, now I know what kind of a filmmaker I am. So but the fact is that I'm not a purist, and I'm not a purist because I've now not really learned filmmaking by putting myself into a certain way of making films. Because even with City Beautiful, which large sections of the film fall into the category of really observational cinema, but then I puncture it also. Even that conversation with Radha's mother is not an observational cinema conversation. So I do puncture that thing constantly, and I'm happy for it, because I am really not a purist. I think any kind of purity one should be very sort of scared of, especially in these times that we're living in. And so that was one thing. The other issue. What was your other the second part of your question, Surabhi? I'm sorry, I should have noted it.
No, there was no second part. I actually did not mean it as me. Yes, I can see that your film language was evolving, but I think there's a lot of value and a lot to hold on to in Majma and in Four Friends Meet. So I wasn't sort of positing them one against the other, but I was also wondering about the times that we are living in and we are moving through that in a sense impact your way of making a film. More and more it seems like, as filmmakers and, as Gautam said, chroniclers, more and more we have to step back and to make sense of what's going on, let things unfold. And perhaps 20 years ago it was possible for us to try and say things in a clearer way, perhaps. So I was actually trying to think about these 20 years through which these four films are made, and what possibly has changed uh, through that.
Yeah, but Surabhi, say, Gautam was also raising this issue of chronicling early in the conversation, and especially given the circumstances we are living in. I think it's so critical right now to build an archive of of human life, because a time will come when you need resources to rebuild, and to somewhere get sanity back, and to actually have ways in which rationality and reason can come back to our lives. And if we don't have this archive, actually, how will that reason and sanity ever come back? This is really, so in that sense, this entire issue of chronicling and archiving, I think is critical right now. It's a critical moment for in the documentary practice also to really have that archive. Or when people will look for ways to regain reason, has to be an archive through which, it happened everywhere. Even in Europe, it happened. People actually just built archives while, all kinds of mess was going on, with the thing that it'll be important when for reason and sanity later. And I think it's very important to keep in different ways. All of us have to do it. It's not just a question of documentary filmmakers.
Just as a final thing, so this commitment to the archive is of course a very important idea, and it's one that has really motivated your work for all these years. But I feel that it is also a certain both commitment to a sense of dignity, as you said, humanizing everyone, but also a certain commitment to hope. So even though you say the factory was in a sense chronicling a failed movement, uh, and there is that sense of disquiet and injustice you leave us with. But at no point do you feel a sense of just overwhelming dark despair. There is a way in which to keep thinking forward. And again, to come back and really tie up what both Gautam and Sanjay have said is to bring it back to real locations. There is a Gurgaon, there is a Sundar Nagari, there is a Meena Bazar, so there is a way in which one has to look at a city afresh, look at what's going on afresh, both from the moments of vulnerabilities and intimacies, but also these broader political strokes, economic strokes uh, that are sort of, tempering the way we move forward. So I can see that we are sort of running out of time. If there's any last comments, Gautam or Sanjay, that you might want to make, or Rahul, that you might want to come in with, you know, just some last thoughts, perhaps, Gautam?
I mean, just briefly, I think, just to take just to take a moment of appreciation and of gratitude. It is not easy putting oneself in a moment to absorb all the grayscale that Rahul has talked about holding on to, especially if it's the one of a very complex human existence. And I think the placeness of his work as a person who shares his love for Delhi, I mean, I think of these films and seeing them together, I had that same sense. I felt an archive in which I could find both my city and myself. And at that point, it doesn't become about the stories of others or about moments in time. It actually becomes about how, like Rahul is saying, archives allow you to find yourself in a shifting present. And they allow you to find roots and traces of imaginations of a future, of different kinds of futures. And I have never thought of that. I think that's why they're not memory. That's why they're not nostalgia. That's actually why they're the work of building time. And building aspirations. And I think that the opportunity that these films give us to reach back and mark ourselves and be present is just a gift. And I think I'm struck again by what lies behind this gift, right? Rahul talked about how heroism entangles us in different ways, but an archive of 20 years also has a lot behind it. And I think it's just a moment to appreciate the fact that this archive is with us, that we have this chance, this body of work, and a commitment to building this kind of archive to offer to the world. So just thanks, Rahul, for being a chance to watch this work, to experience it, and to just selfishly use it as a complete mirror to self and survival and hope. In a strange and complicated time. So I think it's a gift, and I'm very grateful to be able to receive it.
Thank you, Gautam. Thank you.
Some last, Sanjay. You're muted, Sanjay. You're muted.
Yeah, no, I won't add very much except to say that I think Gautam has summarized very well what I think many of us would feel. And also, I think, this is meant as a compliment. I often think of Rahul's films as APW with pictures and video, and that's a good thing. I'm not saying it's a bad thing. So it just before you say that these academics rescue us from these academics. So
We survive on academics. Without academics, we won't be doing our films.
right, but I think that's a good thing, you know, in order to be able to do that, because you know it's a different language and it supplements other kinds of languages we have of speaking about the city and masculinity and labor, capital, whatever. So yeah, I think it's great to have a kind of an EPW with pictures and audio. That's it's you know, just to have EPW by itself, you know, would not be enough. And that's great. Thanks.
Thanks,
In defense of academics, I'm going to declare that Sanjay's joke and not belonging to the larger community. I'm abandoning you, Sanjay. I'm going on Rahul's side of things.
I meant that in a good sense, and I think it's good to have films that allow us to think about things like structure, even for people who don't necessarily want to think about these things. Because that's what it forces you to do. Yeah. Otherwise, people would come across as caricatures. But because they don't come across as caricatures, it's precisely because the films allow us to say, well, why is it that people are like this? There's something else that all of us are part of, not some individual. So these are not individualized biography. They're not individualized, psychologized portraits of people. They're very social portraits of people. And that's important.
Yeah, and these portraits, as you rightly said, Sanjay, Rahul's camera has a way of really dignifying these portraits. So there's always a sense of a non-judgmental and a deeply, I keep coming back to that word, a deeply affectionate kind of gaze with which you are able to sort of locate them as people, but also in a setting that needs to be understood and read. I think, unless Rahul, one last comment from you, and we should.
I just quickly add the other thing. What's very important is that, you know, a lot of these films are screened a lot in NGO context, where quite often people say that you know, there's someone does theory and we do practice. But I think these films also bring across to them that two are completely linked. I know that a lot of these films are used in NGO context, so that's very important.
Yeah.
Sorry, you go ahead.
Thanks, Surabhi. Thank you for organizing this. It's been really pleasure, and it's lovely to be here with all three of you. And at this point of time, I really needed this.
But thank you, Sanjay, thank you, Gautam, thank you, Rahul, and thank you,
Thank you,
Rahul,
Surabhi.
for making these programs available to us so that we can really engage with them in many ways. So thank you all. I will stop the recording and only just wait.